Recently, I've been working on converting up some older Space Marine miniatures to better fit in with the Primaris units that have been released since those miniatures were first brought out. However, sometimes these miniatures have very particular components that are harder to source in other kits, or the components are simply too iconic. One of these characters is this one here, Cato Sicarius, former captain of the Ultramarines 2nd Company and current commander of the Victrix Guard. Using the components found within this current Finecast kit, I set about creating a Primaris version of this well-known character, and I'll be showing you how I did it in this video. So while I used components from the Cato Sicarius set, I also needed a Primaris base for my model, something that would fit both the background and the classic pose of Cato. Luckily for me, the perfect base existed in the form of the Victrix Guard found in the Primaris Cato kit. Not only are these Victrix Guard adorned with ultramarine iconography, but being members of the same order as Cato, it makes perfect sense that his appearance would be similar to the more rank-and-file members. Additionally, the fairly closed-in pose of the model would be quite helpful in recreating the Cato miniature. The one downside about this model is that it's only available when bought together with Primaris Cato. But if you're already an Ultramarine player, then having Calgar in your collection is always helpful, and his Victrix Guard can always be proxied out for Blade Guard veterans instead. So, from this kit, I took the guard who was carrying his shield in his right arm and a sword in his left, removing all the components required to build the model, with the exception of the helmet. Once removed, all these components were cleaned up of mold lines and sprue tabs. My first conversion task was probably the hardest of the whole process and involved the most tedious amount of work. I needed to make room for Cato's sword that is held in his right hand. The Finecast component itself is already separate, but unfortunately a shield covered the Victrix Guard's right hand. So this needed to be cut away. I approached this in several stages. The first involved removing the right hand, along with as much of the shield as possible. For these larger pieces, I made short work of them with my clippers and my saw. These aren't as precise as the knife, but allow me to quickly remove these larger chunks of plastic. As I made the cuts, I ensured that I left the piece of the shield directly attached to the forearm and cape alone for the time being. With some of the larger parts of the shield removed, I next had the task of both carving out the shape of the forearm and also the folds in the cloth that would have been beneath the shield. I started by trimming back the remaining bits of the shield with my knife in order to first flatten out the surfaces. Then, very carefully, I started the long process of scraping away the plastic so that it reformed the cylindrical shape of the forearm, as well as redefining the folds in the cloth. For the folds, I simply followed the line of the existing creases so they gathered up at the front of the right shoulder pad. I found that using a combination of my knife and a rounded hobby file allowed me to smooth out the folds into an acceptable and fairly realistic shape. Once I had finished carving out the arm and the folds of the cloak, I turned my attention to ensuring that I could attach the resin sword to the model. The sword is already a separate component, which helped to keep this a little more straightforward. However, I found that the hand of the sword was not quite lining up properly against the wrist, or where the cloak was attached to the left shoulder. Therefore, I needed to continue trimming. I began by cutting away a little more of the wrist. As I did so, I also added a very slight downward slope to it. This meant that when I brought in the sword to test the fit, the ultramarine style brooch sat a little closer against the right shoulder. However, a few more adjustments still needed to be made to ensure the best fit. Once I was happy with how the components were fitting together, I could move onto the left arm. However, I didn't glue the right arm together just yet, as I wanted to ensure that the final pose looked correct first. Instead, I began to modify the left sword-carrying arm of the Victrix Guard to be able to hold Cato's plumed helmet. The carried helmet components from the Cato kit already came with a hand attached. So instead of trying to adjust the current Victrix Guard hand, I instead decided to just remove it completely. So I needed to begin clipping away the sword hand from the wrist. The wrist has a slight protruding plate of metal across the back of the hand, which also needed to be removed too. With the hand removed, I could smooth out the wrist joint as well as removing the bottom of the sword pommel that was attached to the cape. You'll be glad to hear that this step was overall much easier to perform than removing the shield was. With the sword removed, I just needed to make a couple of slight adjustments to the helmet carrying hand. The wrist had a small protruding tab designed to ensure it could be stuck more easily into the rest of the Finecast model. As I had made the left wrist completely flat, this hand needed to be adjusted to match. I started off by cutting the small bump away before smoothing the joint flat. With this completed, I could check the fit of the helmet against the left arm. This check allowed me to ensure that I was completely happy with how the two components were lining up before I began assembling any components together. Once I was happy with how both the sword and the helmet were sitting, I could begin to glue together the plastic part of the Victrix Guard, with the exception of the backpack, which I still needed to modify. However, at this stage, I did notice that I cut away a little too much of the shield when I was clipping and sawing away with abandon. This left me with a slight step in the cloak when I assembled the two parts together. Thankfully, I was able to trim away the bottom part to smooth out the step, but take this as a warning if you attempt this yourself, to ensure your cloak lines up before you start making any cuts. With the plastic parts of the model assembled, I was able to test the fit of the resin components against the body. When I had fully confirmed that everything was fitting together properly, I was able to glue both the sword and the helmet hands to the body. So, at this point, I could finally see how the model was coming together. I've been able to replicate the pose of the original Cato Sicarius miniature to a decent degree, but I still needed to add the head. Once again, I decided to use the resin component from the original kit to help better tie him in to that original model. However, when I attempted to match up the head to the body, I could see that yet more trimming needed to happen. The first piece to be removed was the slight lip around the bottom of the neck. This narrowed down the neck significantly to allow me to glue it into the neck joint. Luckily, the Finecast resin is quite soft and can be trimmed really easily. With this done, I could check the fit and see where I needed to make any additional cuts. Once I was happy with how everything was looking and fitting together, I could bring in the superglue and make this permanent. Now that Cato had a body and a head, the only thing that was missing from him was his backpack. I wanted to use the original banner pole to stay as close to that original miniature as possible, but I decided to give him the larger Mark 10 power armor size power pack instead. So, to marry these two halves together, I first needed to carefully cut the bottom of the pole away from the resin backpack before smoothing the bottom flat once again. The problem I now faced was getting the banner pole to stick to the backpack. Attaching such a large and protruding component with a small footprint would have been tricky to pull off without the banner falling off in the slightest of breezes. To remedy this, I drilled a hole into the underside of the banner pole and also to the center of the top of the power pack. With a length of 1mm steel wire, the same thickness as the hole that I drilled, I glued the wire into one of these holes with some superglue. I allowed this to dry for a little time before bringing in my clippers and trimming the wire. I left a few millimeters protruding from the base of the flag, just enough to be inserted into the hole that I drilled into the top of the backpack. I then used a little bit more superglue to attach the banner and the power pack with a much sturdier bond. And with that, all that's left to do is to assemble and paint the miniature, which left me with this. And here we have the completed Primaris Cato Sicarius, painted in the colours of the ultramarines. Once again, this character tutorial was a bit more of a challenge than some of my previous guides. However, trying to modernise older models or create new ones based on characters is an extremely rewarding task. It was also the first time that I had made use of some Finecast components in one of my conversion guides. While they still have their usual drawbacks of bubbles and bendy pieces, they are surprisingly easy to convert with. The resin is just soft enough to cut through and they don't look too out of place once painted up. It also allowed me to get a hold of components that would have been really hard to source otherwise. So, as always, I just want to say a big thank you to all of my supporters and the folks who use my affiliate links. If you would like to help me out with making these videos, you can support me on Buy Me a Coffee as a one-off or as an ongoing membership, and you also get access to some early release videos and some behind the scenes photos too. and you can find a link to that below. Your help is always greatly appreciated. And if you like this video, then check out my other conversion guides, and please do consider subscribing. So, until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.